Today's story is The Weight of What He Lost, a sequel to He Called Her a Mistake, She Built an Empire. This is Leo's story. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Mercer Pack still ran on lists. That much hadn't changed. The duty roster was still pinned to the board in the operations room, the supply schedule still filed by week, month and quarter, the dispute log still current, dated, and followed up within 48 hours. Leo Mercer had kept every system Lisa built because dismantling them would have meant admitting he didn't understand why they worked, and there had been enough of that particular admission to last him a lifetime. He was 44 now. There was grey coming in at his temples that hadn't been there 5 years ago, and a stillness to him in meetings that hadn't been there either. The kind of stillness that came from having learned, the hard way, that the loudest man in the room wasn't always the one who was right. He was at his desk before 7 most mornings now. Coffee, not tea. He'd never managed to like tea the way Lisa had. The boundary dispute on his desk this morning was nothing he couldn't handle. 2 families on the east side arguing about a drainage easement any competent mediator could settle in an afternoon. He read the file twice anyway, because reading things twice was a habit he'd built deliberately, the way a man builds a habit he knows he lacked previously. Harry Sullivan put his head round the door at 7:15, still beta, still the only person in the pack who spoke to Leo like an equal rather than an alpha. "You're going to want to deal with the Bramley situation before the Dunmore lot arrive at 10, Harry said. "And your nephew has redecorated the East Corridor with what I'm reliably informed is blackberry jam." "He's not my nephew." "Tell him that. See how far it gets you." Leo almost smiled. Harry's boy, Tom, was 4 years old and had absolutely no respect for chain of command, which Leo found he didn't mind nearly as much as he probably should. He'd been born the year after everything fell apart with his ex-wife Lisa. He was Jen and Harry's son, and he'd decided early and without consultation that Leo belonged to him in some capacity nobody had ever quite defined. Uncle Leo, he called him, with the kind of certainty 4-year-olds reserved for things they had never once doubted. "I'll deal with the jam," Leo said, "and the easement. Dunmore can wait until 10 regardless." Harry didn't leave straight away. He stood in the doorway a moment, the way he did sometimes when there was something on his mind he hadn't decided whether to say. "What?" Leo said. "Nothing." Harry paused. "Alliance gathering invitation came through. Slade territory, end of the month. Lisa's hosting." The name didn't land the way it used to. That was the strange part, the part Leo hadn't expected when the worst of it finally passed. It used to be a blow, hearing it, a fist to something that hadn't healed. Now it was just weather, a fact about the world, like rain in October. "We'll go," Leo said. "Mercer needs the Slade Alliance more than they need ours, and pretending otherwise insults everyone involved." "That wasn't a question." "Wasn't it?" Harry looked at him for a moment longer, that careful, assessing look Leo remembered from years ago, the one Harry used to give Lisa when he thought Leo wasn't watching. Leo had learned, eventually, to recognize it for what it was. Harry watching someone he cared about and deciding whether they were going to be all right. "You'll see Cade there," Harry said, "and the little one." "I know." "And you're fine with that?" "I didn't say I was fine with it, I said I'd go." Leo closed the file in front of him. "There's a difference, and you, of all people, know it." Harry's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "Fair enough." He turned to go, then stopped again, because Harry never could resist the last word. "For what it's worth, you held the Dunmore line yourself last quarter. No notes from anyone, no fallback position drafted by somebody else at 1 in the morning. "Is that meant to be a comfort?" "It's meant to be true," Harry said, and left him to it. The jam, it turned out, had reached as far as the operations room notice board, which meant the duty roster now bore a faintly purple thumbprint in the corner of March. Tom himself was sitting in the middle of the corridor, looking profoundly unbothered by the chaos he'd created, a jar clutched to his chest like contraband. "Uncle Leo!" He said it the way he said everything, as though it settled a matter rather than opened one. "Want some jam?" "I want to know how you got into the larder." "I climbed." "Of course you did." Leo crouched down to Tom's level, which had become, somewhere in the last 4 years, an instinct rather than a decision. "Your mother is going to climb several walls of her own when she sees this corridor." "You won't tell." "I absolutely will tell," Leo told him firmly. Tom considered this with the gravity of a much older negotiator weighing his options, then held the jar out anyway, an offering, as though the threat of exposure was an acceptable price for company. Leo took it, more to stop the boy eating it with his fingers than out of any real desire for jam at 7:30 in the morning, and sat back against the wall beside him, while somewhere down the corridor a cleaning crew began, with visible long suffering, to deal with the notice board. He hadn't expected this, any of it, not the boy, not the easy way he'd folded into the rhythm of Leo's days, not the particular ache of affection that came with watching a child who wasn't his grow up adjacent to a life that might have looked like this, once, with different faces in it. He didn't let himself finish that thought very often. He just let himself start it sometimes. Today, sitting on the floor of a jam-stained corridor with a 4-year-old boy leaning against his arm, he let it run a little further than usual before he put it away. It wasn't grief for Lisa anymore. He'd done that grieving, properly, in the brutal first couple of years when Harry had refused, more than once, to let him drink his way past it. Then in the slower years after that, when the pack had needed him sober and present more than it needed him punished. What was left now was something quieter and, in its own way, harder to carry. Not missing her. Missing the version of his own life where he hadn't been such a fool. The marriage that might have lasted. The children who might have looked like this one, underfoot, unbothered, and entirely certain of their welcome. He'd built that future and thrown it away with both hands, and the man who'd done it had been so sure of himself he hadn't even noticed the weight of what he was setting down. "Uncle Leo?" Tom again, tugging at his sleeve. "You're doing the sad face." "Am I?" "Mummy says you do it when you think nobody's looking." Leo looked down at him properly for the first time. "Does she?" "I'm looking, though," the boy said seriously. "So you are." He ruffled the boy's hair, which earned him an indignant squawk, a renewed assault on what remained of the jam, and got to his feet before the conversation could go any further into territory a 4-year-old had no business observing so accurately. "Go and find your mother. Tell her the jam incident was entirely your own doing, and I refuse to take any of the blame." "That's snitching." "It's accuracy. There's a difference, and you'll learn it eventually." Tom ran off down the corridor at the particular speed of a child fleeing accountability, and Leo stood watching him go for longer than the moment strictly required. The Dunmore meeting went well. It always did now. He'd stopped needing someone else's notes in his pocket 2 years ago, stopped needing Harry's quiet confirmation in the corner of the room. The strange thing was that the pack hadn't suffered for it. If anything, Mercer ran better now than it had in years. Supply chains steady, dispute logs current, the eastern boundary settled and quiet for the first time in a decade. He'd listened. That was the whole of it, in the end. The lesson that had taken him a marriage, a wife, and the better part of 5 years to learn properly. He'd listened to Harry, and through Harry, eventually, to the version of himself that Lisa had spent 3 years quietly trying to reach. It was a bitter kind of competence, knowing it had come too late to matter to the one person it should have mattered to first. He stood at the window of his office that evening, the operations room emptying out below, and thought about the alliance gathering at the end of the month, about Slade territory, the woman who ran it, and the family she'd built there without him, and realised what he felt, mostly, wasn't dread. It was something closer to readiness, as if some part of him had been waiting 5 years for permission to stop circling the wreckage and start building something that was actually his. He didn't know yet what that would look like. He was, for the first time in a long while, curious to find out. The decision to bring in outside help hadn't been Leo's idea, not at first. It was Harry who'd raised it, back in the spring, over a stack of quarterly reports that had taken twice as long to compile as they should have. Mercer had grown. 3 new bloodlines absorbed in as many years, the southern holdings finally productive after a decade of neglect, alliance obligations that multiplied faster than the systems built to track them. The pack Lisa had once run from a single operations table now needed something closer to a proper administrative structure, and neither Leo nor Harry, for all their improvements, had the specific expertise to build one without breaking what already worked. "We need someone who's done this before," Harry had said. "Not another set of hands, someone who can look at the whole thing and tell us what's actually wrong with it, not just patch the bit that's currently on fire." Leo had resisted the idea longer than he'd admit to anyone but himself. Bringing in an outsider to assess the pack felt, uncomfortably, like admitting that 5 years of work hadn't been enough, that the structure he'd rebuilt with his own hands still had a stranger's eye missing from it. It had taken Harry pointing out, with his usual lack of tact, that the alternative was Leo quietly running himself into the ground, trying to be both alpha and the woman who used to make the alpha's job possible, for Leo to finally agree to it. The alliance contact who'd recommended Naomi Ashford had been brief and oddly specific. Naomi had untangled a territorial merger that should have ended in bloodshed, and instead ended in a working pack with a functioning chain of command inside 8 months. She didn't take posts that lasted longer than a season. She didn't, by all accounts, care in the slightest whether the alpha in question liked her or not. That, Harry had said, was probably the best part of her. The woman from Hartwell arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days earlier than a letter had promised, which Leo decided afterwards was probably deliberate. Her name was Naomi Ashford, former beater of the Hartwell pack, widowed the past 2 years. She didn't arrive with fanfare. She arrived with a single suitcase, a folder of preliminary notes she'd apparently compiled from nothing but Mercer's public alliance filings, and an expression that suggested she'd already formed several opinions and was waiting to see whether the pack would confirm or contradict them. "You're early," Leo said, meeting her in the entrance hall because Harry had been halfway through a phone call and someone had to. "I find packs behave more honestly when they're not expecting you." She looked round the entrance hall with the frank, assessing attention of someone pricing a property. "Your notice board's crooked." "I'm aware." "Your operations room is 2 doors down on the left, I'd guess, given the foot traffic pattern from the front door. You've got someone running supply logistics who's good at the job and underused, and your duty roster's still being managed manually instead of online, which, for a pack your size, is costing you about 4 hours a week somebody could be spending on something that matters." Leo looked at her for a long moment. "Did you read all that off the notice board?" "I read it off you, mostly." Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "A pack runs as well as the person at the top lets it. You're either very good at delegating or very tired. I'll know which by Friday." She was, over the following week, an unsettling kind of company, because she watched everything and said very little about what she saw. Leo found himself more than once narrating his own decisions aloud simply to fill the silence and gauge her reaction. She didn't flatter him. She also didn't undermine him in front of the pack, which he'd half expected from someone hired to find what was broken. Harry, for his part, had taken to her almost immediately. "I like her," Harry said. "You like anyone who agrees the Eastern patrols are underfunded." Leo grumbled back at him. "I like her because she's right, and because she told you to your face that your accounts reconciliation process was, and I'm quoting directly, an act of self-harm dressed up as diligence." "She did say that," Leo agreed. "She's not wrong." The Eastern boundary problem announced itself on the Thursday, the way these things usually did, without warning and at the worst possible hour. A patrol radioed in just before dusk. 3 unfamiliar scent trails crossing from Dunmore land onto Mercer's side of the river, fresh enough that whoever it was hadn't gone far. 5 years ago, Leo would have gone himself immediately, alone, because going himself immediately and alone had felt, at the time, like the only acceptable shape of leadership. He didn't do that now. "Harry, take the lead team to the crossing point. I want eyes on the trail before we commit to anything." He was already moving toward the operations room, already pulling the territory map. "If it's a stray pair looking for new ground, we don't need force, we need a conversation. If it's Dunmore testing the line again after last month, I want it documented properly before anyone does anything that could be read as provocation." "And you?" "I'll coordinate from here unless you need me on the ground." Harry actually stopped in the doorway at that, something unreadable crossing his face before he caught himself and nodded and went.
Naomi had been in the operations room throughout, unpacking a box of files at the far table. She watched the whole exchange without comment until Harry had gone and the room had emptied into the particular taut quiet that came before news. "You didn't go," she said, not a question. "No." "5 years ago, would you have?" 5 years ago, I'd have been halfway across the eastern fields before Harry finished the sentence, and I'd have made whatever was happening considerably worse by getting there first and thinking second. Leo didn't look up from the map. "I've learned that an alpha who needs to be the one who solves everything personally isn't running a pack. He's running an audience." Naomi was quiet for a moment. When he glanced up, she was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen from her yet, something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite approval, but sat somewhere adjacent to both. "That's not the answer I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Honestly, I expected you to go anyway and tell me afterwards it was strategic." She came over to the map, looked at the marked crossing point, the river, the patrol routes. "I've worked with a lot of alphas who'd kept every system someone else built and convinced themselves that meant they'd changed. You actually let go of something just now. That's different." "You say that like you've been testing me." "I have been testing you. It's the job." She didn't apologise for it. "Most of what I'm here to fix isn't paperwork. It's whether the man at the top of the structure understands why the structure exists. So far, you're the first one in a while who does." The radio crackled before Leo could answer. Harry's voice, steady, a little breathless from the run. 2 wolves, young, unaffiliated, displaced from a dissolved pack 2 territories over and looking for somewhere to land. No threat. Harry had already offered them water in a conversation rather than a confrontation, and wanted to know whether Leo would authorise a provisional stay while the Alliance office checked their history. "Authorised," Leo said into the radio. "Get them fed properly before you bring them in. And, Harry, good work." There was a pause on the other end, the particular pause of a man unused to being thanked for doing his job well, and then Harry said, dry as ever, "Don't get used to saying that. I'll start expecting it," and signed off. Leo set the radio down. When he looked up, Naomi was still watching him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there wasn't anything assessing in it. "Friday," she said. "You asked when I'd know which it was. Good at delegating, or very tired?" "And?" "Both, probably. But mostly the first one now." She picked a folder back up off the table, businesslike again, the moment closing over as efficiently as it had opened. "Your filing system for territorial incident reports is still a disgrace, though. We'll fix that tomorrow." "Looking forward to it." "You won't be. Nobody enjoys being reorganised." She was nearly at the door when she paused, not quite turning back. "For what it's worth, whatever happened here years ago with your ex-wife, the pack talks about it the way people talk about weather they've lived through, not with anger, like something that shaped the ground and then passed." A beat. "That's not nothing, you know. Most men in your position spend years trying to outrun what they did. You let yours become the foundation for your future." She left before he could find anything to say to that, which he suspected was deliberate too. He stood alone in the operations room a while longer, the territory map still open on the table, the last of the daylight going out of the windows, and thought, not for the first time that week, that he had absolutely no idea what to do with a woman who refused to be impressed by him, and which somehow made that the most interesting thing about her. Chapter 3. Naomi worked the way she talked, fast, exact, and without much patience for anything that didn't serve a purpose. Within a fortnight, the duty roster ran itself. The supply chain was cross-referenced against 3 years of data nobody had thought to compile, and she'd informed Leo, without any particular ceremony, that his account reconciliation system was finally an act of competence rather than self-harm. She didn't soften criticism, she didn't dress up praise either, and Leo found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he'd started looking forward to both in roughly equal measure. They worked late most evenings, the operations room emptied out around them, files spread across the table that Lisa used to claim before 7 every morning. It was an odd kind of intimacy. The two of them bent over the same spreadsheet at 9 at night, arguing about whether the Eastern Patrol rotation needed 4 wolves or 5. Leo noticed, somewhere in the second week, that he'd stopped thinking of those evenings as work and started thinking of them as the best part of his day. "You're staring," Naomi said one such evening, not looking up from the page in front of her. "I'm thinking." "You're staring while thinking, then, multitasking." She turned the page round to face him. "Sign off on the Southern reallocation or don't. I haven't got all night." "Haven't you?" "No." Something flickered across her face, there and gone before he could name it. "I don't stay anywhere long enough to have all night anywhere. Contract work doesn't allow for it." "How long is this one?" 6 weeks, give or take. I'm already past the halfway point." She said it lightly, the way she said most things, but Leo had spent enough years learning to read what people weren't saying that he caught the edge underneath it anyway. "I fix what's broken and I leave before anyone gets too attached to having me around. It's a better system than the alternative." "What's the alternative?" "Staying somewhere long enough for people to need you and then losing the right to leave when you decide you should." She said it without self-pity, a fact stated rather than a wound exposed, but Leo recognised the shape of it regardless. He'd heard enough of Harry's careful second-hand version of her history to know roughly where it came from. A husband, a pack in the north, a death that had nothing graceful or expected about it. She'd left that pack within the year and hadn't properly stayed anywhere since. "That's not really a system," Leo said. "That's just leaving first so nobody else gets the chance to." Naomi went very still for a moment, and Leo wondered if he'd overstepped, said something a man 5 years more careful with people ought to have known better than to say out loud on a Tuesday evening over a spreadsheet. But she didn't snap at him. She didn't deflect either. She just looked at him for a long moment with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, something unguarded enough that he understood, suddenly, exactly how rare it was. "That's an uncomfortably accurate way of putting it," she said eventually. "Sign the reallocation." He signed it. The moment closed back over, businesslike again. But something had shifted in the room. They both knew it, and neither of them said anything further about it that night. The trouble with the Western patrol rotation happened a few days later, and it was, Leo thought afterwards, the first time he'd seen Naomi be properly wrong about anything. She'd cut the route past the old denning ground on the Western Ridge, citing 3 months of incident data that showed nothing had crossed that stretch of boundary in over a year. Statistically redundant, she'd called it, freeing up 2 wolves a week for the southern coverage that genuinely needed them. It was good logic. It was also, Harry pointed out afterwards with considerably less patience than he usually managed, logic that hadn't accounted for old Mab Ferris, who lived alone at the western edge of the territory and had taken a bad fall 8 months ago that had never made it into any incident log because nobody had thought a stumble in her own garden counted as a territorial matter. The patrol that used to pass her cottage twice a night had been the reason anyone found her at the time. Since the patrols had been cut, Mab had gone 2 days without anyone checking on her before a neighbour noticed her lights hadn't come on. The fright of it had rattled the whole Western household badly enough that 3 families had raised it directly with Harry, concerned and angry about what they saw as a cost-cutting exercise that put an old woman's life at risk. "You cut a route because the data said it was safe," Harry told Naomi flatly in the operations room, "but the data didn't know an 81-year-old woman lived at the end of it." He paused. "I'm not just blaming you, Naomi. This was my fault as well. I should have taken Mab into account when we were discussing the route changes." Naomi didn't argue. Leo watched her take it in, watched something close and careful cross her face, the particular stillness of someone confronting a mistake she hadn't seen coming because she'd been so certain her method accounted for everything that mattered. "I should have asked," she said eventually. "I looked at 3 months of incidents and decided that was the whole picture. It wasn't. I'm truly sorry, not as a formality, truly. I'll go and see her myself and apologise. Then I'll rebuild the rotation with the patrols who actually know the ground rather than just the numbers." She did exactly that, the same afternoon, on foot, with no one accompanying her and no attempt to make it look better than it was. Leo didn't ask how the visit went. He didn't need to. The patrol rotation was rebuilt by the following morning, with the western route fully restored. Naomi never mentioned the incident again, but Leo noticed in the days after that she started asking long-serving wolves what they knew before she trusted what the spreadsheets told her. He understood, watching her do it, that he wasn't the only one in the building learning something the hard way. It became, over the following week, a habit neither of them named. Naomi stayed later than her work required. Leo found reasons to be in the operations room past the point any reasonable alpha needed to be reviewing supply data. Harry noticed, because Harry noticed everything. He confined his commentary to the occasional raised eyebrow and once the deeply unhelpful observation that he hadn't seen Leo this distracted by a spreadsheet since Lisa used to leave him annotated alliance briefs. "That's not the same thing," Leo said. "Didn't say it was. Said it reminded me of it." Harry leaned in the doorway with the particular smugness of a man who'd been right about something for several weeks running. "You like her." "I respect her." "You can do both. People generally do, when it's the real thing rather than whatever you had with Heather." Harry said the name without weight, and Leo noted, almost clinically, that it landed exactly the way it should do. No flinch, just a name from an embarrassing period of his life he'd long since stopped carrying. "The question is whether you're going to do anything useful about it before her contract runs out, or stand here staring meaningfully at her until she leaves and you spend another 5 years regretting it." "That's not a fair comparison." "Isn't it?" Harry's voice softened, the dry edge dropping away. "You got a second chance to be the kind of man worth staying for. Don't waste it being too careful to ask for what you actually want." Leo didn't have an answer for that, not one he was willing to give Harry that evening, but he turned it over for a long time after Harry had gone, sitting alone in the quiet of the operations room with Naomi's neat, decisive handwriting still visible on the page in front of him, and found that the thought he kept arriving at wasn't fear. It was the same readiness he'd felt the night he'd first heard about the Alliance gathering. Something in him, finally, ready to stop circling and start reaching for what he actually wanted. He had just over a week left to work out how. Chapter 4. Slade territory looked exactly as prosperous as the reports always claimed it did, and Leo had spent 5 years reading enough of those reports to recognize every sign of it the moment the car came up the drive. Well-maintained boundary fencing, new construction on the eastern side, paid for rather than scraped together. The unmistakable, unhurried confidence of a pack that wasn't fighting for survival and hadn't been for a long time. Lisa's work, every single inch of it. "You're doing the thing," Naomi said from the seat beside him, not looking up from the Alliance briefing she was reviewing one final time before they arrived. "Where you go quiet and your jaw does something complicated." "I wasn't aware my jaw was that expressive," he replied dryly. "It's very expressive. It's currently saying you'd rather be anywhere else than here." She closed the folder. "You don't have to pretend composure for me, Leo. I already know where you are. Harry filled me in his own roundabout way, before we left." "Did he now?" "Enough of it. The marriage, the mistake. 5 years of paying for it properly instead of just feeling bad about it in private, which he seemed to think mattered more than the mistake itself." She studied him for a moment, the assessing look he'd grown unexpectedly fond of over the past few weeks. "For what it's worth, you don't owe anyone in there a performance. Not grief, and not indifference either. Just be whoever you actually are now. That's usually enough." It was, Leo thought, exactly the right thing to say, delivered in exactly the wrong tone to be comforting, which was somehow the most comforting thing about it. He saw Lisa within the first 20 minutes, across the main hall, deep in conversation with a cluster of allied beaters, entirely in her element. She looked well, happier than he remembered her looking, even in the early years of their marriage, the kind of settled, unguarded happiness that came from a life built on the right foundations rather than the wrong ones. Cade was beside her, a hand resting easy at the small of her back, and between them, weaving determinedly through a forest of adult legs in pursuit of nothing in particular, was a small girl with Lisa's exact, focused frown. Leo didn't look away straight away. He let himself watch her properly. The little girl, 3 years old if the reports were right, utterly absorbed in whatever small mission had brought her under the refreshment table and back out again with one shoe missing. She had Lisa's seriousness about her, that same quality of taking the world entirely on her own terms, and Cade's easy laugh when she finally noticed the shoe was gone and looked faintly betrayed by her own foot. Nobody in the hall paid her any particular attention beyond the fond, unhurried kind reserved for a child who was loved and knew it without ever having had to test the fact. That could have been his life. His child. Not this child. Not this exact small face with its exact small frown, but some version of it, some life running parallel to this one, where he was the man standing beside Lisa with his hand at the small of her back, instead of the man watching from across a crowded hall. He let the thought arrive in full this time, didn't put it away early the way he usually did, let it sit in his chest with all its old, particular weight. It still ached. It would probably always ache, a little, the way an old break in a bone aches before rain. But it didn't break him open the way it would have once. It simply was. A true thing about the shape of his own life, observed rather than fought. Leo watched them for a moment longer than he meant to. He waited, the way he always did now, for the old wound to announce itself. It didn't. There was an ache, but it was the bittersweet kind. The kind a man felt looking at a photograph of a beautiful place he'd once had the chance to live in and chosen, through his own carelessness, not to. Lisa saw him a few minutes later. She crossed the hall without hesitation, which he appreciated more than he could easily have explained, because it meant she didn't see him as something to be managed or avoided. Just an old acquaintance from a chapter of her life that had ended the way it needed to. Leo. She said his name evenly, no warmth wasted, none withheld either. You're looking well. So are you. The territory's beautiful. You've done remarkable work here. I had good training. There was the faintest curve to her mouth, not unkind, the closest thing to a private joke they had left between them. Her eyes moved briefly to Naomi, standing a polite distance away. And you've brought someone. Naomi Ashford. She's been restructuring Mercer's operations for the past month. Has she? Lisa's gaze sharpened with professional interest rather than anything more complicated. Hartwell's Naomi Ashford. I've heard excellent things. You're the reason the Calder merger didn't end in bloodshed. I had good material to work with, Naomi said, which made Lisa actually laugh, short and genuine, and something in the moment settled into an ease none of them had any particular right to expect. Mercer's lucky to have you, Lisa said, and then to Leo, with no edge in it at all. Mercer's lucky to have made the changes it has. Harry tells Cade things sometimes over the Alliance correspondence. I'm glad it's true. I'm glad you're well, Leo. I'm glad you're happy, he said, and meant it entirely, and felt the saying of it land somewhere quiet and finely healed in his own chest. Truly. Lisa studied him a moment longer, as if checking the words against the man saying them, and found them, for the first time in longer than either of them would say aloud, a perfect match. Then she nodded once and went to find Cade. And that was the whole of it. No drama, no reckoning. Just two people who'd once shared a life, meeting again as something quieter and entirely sufficient. Heather found him an hour later by the refreshment table, her husband at her side and a baby asleep against his shoulder. Duncan Calloway hovered nearby, older now, still telling the same 3 stories to anyone who'd stand still long enough. Leo. Heather's smile was easy, unburdened, the smile of a woman who'd built a life with no complicated weight attached to his name. You look well. genuinely. So do you. He meant it. There wasn't a trace of the old strangeness in saying it, none of the charged confusion that had once made a fool of him in this exact kind of room. Congratulations, on all of it. Thank you. She glanced at her husband, at the sleeping baby, with a fondness that had nothing to do with Leo at all, and never had. It worked out, didn't it? For both of us in the end. It did, Leo said, and was faintly amazed at how easily the words came, how little they cost him. He'd spent years assuming forgiveness would feel like a door finally opening. It faced instead like a door he'd already walked through some time ago, without quite noticing. He found Naomi again near the edge of the hall, watching the whole gathering with the same frank attention she brought to a spreadsheet. When their eyes met, she didn't ask him how it had gone. She simply held his gaze a moment, steady. Something passed between them that needed no words at all, an understanding that the man standing in front of her was exactly, finally, who he'd been trying to become. "Well," she said when he reached her, "how was the weather in there?" "Clear," Leo said, "for the first time in 5 years." Naomi smiled, properly this time, the kind of smile she didn't often spend on anyone, and Leo thought, with a clarity that startled him, that he would very much like to spend the rest of his life learning how to earn more of that smile. The drive back from Slade territory was quiet in a way that felt earned rather than awkward, the particular silence of two people who'd watched each other through something significant and didn't need to narrate it to know it had mattered. It didn't last. Within a day, Naomi was back to her usual brisk efficiency, finishing the last of the pack's administrative overhaul with the same exacting focus she'd brought to the first day. Leo understood, watching her work through the final items on her list with visible, deliberate speed, exactly what she was doing. She was finishing early. "Your contract runs another fortnight," he said, finding her in the operations room on a Thursday evening, a stack of completed files squared off neatly on the table in front of her like a closing argument. "I'm ahead of schedule. Mercer's in better shape than most packs I've worked with." She didn't look up. "There's no reason to drag it out," she continued. "Isn't there?" That made her look up. "Leo, you said you leave before anyone gets too attached. I think you're finishing early because you're already past that point and you'd rather go now, on your own terms, than wait for it to become something you can't walk away from cleanly." He kept his voice steady, the way he'd learned to keep it in negotiations that mattered, because this mattered more than any of those ever had. "I think you're doing to this what I used to do to everything, deciding the outcome before anyone's actually given you a reason to." Naomi set down her pen with great precision. "That's not a fair thing to say to someone who's just done excellent work for your pack." "It's not about the work. The work's been extraordinary and you know it." He came round the table, not crowding her, just close enough that she couldn't pretend the conversation was about filing systems any longer. "I'm asking you not to leave early. Not because the contract isn't finished, because I don't want you to go. And I think, if you're honest, some part of you doesn't entirely want to either." She held his gaze for a long moment, something fierce and unguarded moving behind her composure before she got it back under control. "I don't do this, Leo. I don't stay. I told you why." "You told me a system. You didn't tell me it was the right one." He didn't reach for her, didn't push further than the words themselves. "I spent years building the wrong life because I was too sure of myself to listen to anyone who might have told me otherwise.
I'm not asking you to abandon everything you've built to protect yourself. I'm asking you to consider, just once, that staying might not cost you what leaving someone else already did." Naomi didn't answer. She gathered her files instead, careful and contained, and left the operations room without another word. Leo stood alone in the quiet afterwards, wondering whether he'd finally said the right thing 5 years too clumsily, or said entirely the wrong thing at exactly the moment it mattered most. Harry found him there 20 minutes later, still standing by the table, doing nothing in particular, except turning the conversation over in his head. "Well," Harry said, "you look like a man who's made a mess of something." "I told her not to leave." And she left the room." Harry considered this with the maddening calm of a man who already suspected how the story ended and was simply waiting for Leo to catch up to it. "Are you going to go after her?" Harry asked. "I don't know what I'd say that I haven't already said." "Then say it again, differently, or the same way if it was the right way. You're allowed to try more than once, you know. Most worthwhile things take more than one attempt." Harry leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, and for a moment something genuinely fond passed across his face, the particular warmth of a man who'd spent 5 years waiting for this exact evening. "Are you going to ask for my help with this, or are we doing the part where you pretend you don't need it first?" "Are you going to help, or just crow?" "No." Harry let the words sit a moment, just long enough to land properly. "You've had 5 years to prepare for this." Leo laughed, the sound surprising him as much as it seemed to surprise Harry, because it was exactly the kind of thing Harry would say, and exactly the kind of thing Leo needed to hear. The old, dry, unsentimental affection of a friend who'd stood beside him through the worst version of himself and stayed anyway. "Fine," Leo said. "I'll do it myself." "Good." Harry pushed off the doorframe, already turning to go, and added, almost as an afterthought, "For what it's worth, she squared off those files like she was leaving a door open rather than closing one. People who genuinely don't want to be found don't leave a paper trail that organized." He left Leo alone with that thought. Leo found, standing in the quiet operations room with the last of the evening light going gold across the table, that he finally knew exactly what he wanted to do next. Chapter 6. He found her the following morning at the edge of the eastern fields, standing exactly where the boundary patrol had picked up the scent trail a month before, her case already packed and sitting by her car. "You're leaving today," Leo said, "not in a fortnight." "I told you, I'm ahead of schedule." She didn't turn round straight away. The morning mist hadn't fully lifted yet, and she stood watching it move across the grass with the particular stillness of someone who'd rehearsed leaving so many times it had become its own kind of comfort. "It's better this way." "Better for who?" "For both of us, eventually. You'd thank me for it in a year." She finally turned, and there was nothing performed about the steadiness in her voice, only the old, careful armor of a woman who'd built her whole life around never being caught somewhere she couldn't leave cleanly. "I watched you yesterday at the gathering. I watched you stand in a room with everyone who ever broke your heart or got broken by you, and come out the other side of it whole. That's rare, Leo. That's not nothing. But I'm not in the business of being someone's next chapter. I'm in the business of fixing things and moving on before I matter enough to anyone for it to cost something when I go." "You already matter," Leo said. "That's the part you're trying to outrun." She didn't answer immediately. He let the silence sit, the way he'd learned to in 5 years of meetings that mattered,
the way he'd never quite managed to when it counted most the first time round. "I'm not asking you to give up the work you do, or the way you do it," he said. "I'm not asking you to become someone who stays in one place because I want her to. I watched a woman build an entire pack out of being underestimated and walking away with her dignity intact. I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful she had the strength to do it, even though it cost me everything. I'm not interested in repeating that mistake from the other side of it. I'm not asking you to stay because leaving would be inconvenient for me. I'm asking because I think if you let yourself actually consider it instead of running the calculation in advance, you'd find the answer isn't as certain as you're pretending it is. And if I stay and it goes wrong? Then it goes wrong, and you'll have lost time you can't get back, and so will I. That's the cost of letting anyone matter. I spent 3 years in a marriage refusing to pay the cost properly, and I lost everything that mattered because of it. I'm done deciding outcomes in advance to avoid the risk of being wrong." He held her gaze, steady, no performance left in him at all. "I'm not asking for certainty. I'm asking for the chance to find out, the same way you'd give any other pack the chance to prove your assessment of them wrong." Naomi looked at him for a long time, the mist thinning around them, the morning settling into proper daylight. Something in her face came close to undone before she caught it and held it together by what looked like sheer practice. "I need to think," she said, "properly, not standing in a field with you watching me do it." She picked up her case. "That's not a no, Leo. It's the truth. I've spent 2 years building a way of living that's kept me from being hurt again, and I'm not going to dismantle it in a 5-minute conversation just because it would be a satisfying place to end one." "How long do you need?" "I don't know. That's rather the point of needing it." She held his gaze, steady despite everything underneath it. "I'll call Harry when Alec's out, not you. You'll only try to talk me round again, and I need to know what I'd choose without your voice in my ear while I'm choosing it." She got into the car before he could find an answer to that. Leo stood at the edge of the eastern fields and watched her go, the same patch of ground where a month ago he'd stood and chosen not to run after a problem himself and had counted it as growth. It felt nothing like growth now. It felt like standing very still while something he wanted badly drove away from him. Standing still because she'd asked him to, and because, for once in his life, he was capable of respecting a boundary, even when it cost him. The week that followed was, Leo thought privately, one of the longer ones of his life, and he had some experience now of long weeks. He worked. He sat in alliance meetings and held positions without anyone else's notes in his pocket. He signed off on a southern reallocation Naomi had rebuilt, with the long-serving wolves' knowledge folded properly into the numbers, and found that competence, on its own, was no longer quite enough to fill the hours the way it used to be. Tom noticed before anyone else did the way children generally noticed the things adults tried hardest to hide. "Where's the spreadsheet, lady?" he asked on the 3rd day, with the particular bluntness of a 4-year-old who saw no reason to dress a question up. "She's gone to think about something." "Is she thinking about you?" "Probably," Leo admitted, because lying to Tom had never worked particularly well, and he saw no reason to start now. "Is that good thinking or bad thinking?" "I don't know yet." Tom considered this with great seriousness, the same gravity he'd once brought to the matter of a stolen jam jar, and said, "Daddy says good things take ages. He says you took ages and you turned out all right in the end." Which was, Leo reflected afterwards, both an enormous comfort and exactly the kind of thing Harry would say to a 4-year-old, without thinking through how it would land second-hand. Harry himself said very little that week, beyond confirming on the 5th day that he'd had a brief call from Naomi, that she was well, and that he wasn't going to share a single other detail, no matter how many times Leo asked. "She specifically said not to tell you anything," Harry said, with evident enjoyment. "I'm rather looking forward to keeping that promise." "You're enjoying this?" "I'm enjoying watching you sit with not knowing something, for once, instead of going out and solving it yourself before anyone's had the chance to decide anything on their own terms." Harry's voice softened, the dry edge falling away the way it sometimes did when he meant something properly. "You did the hard part already, Leo. You told her the truth and you let her go think about it, instead of following her out of the door and making the decision for her. That's not nothing. That's the whole 5 years right there, in one morning." "It doesn't feel like progress. It feels like waiting." "Most progress does, from the inside." She called on the 8th day, not Harry this time, but Leo directly, and asked him to meet her at the old crossing point on the eastern boundary, the place where the patrol had found the displaced wolves a month before her contract had ended early. He was there before she arrived, the evening settling gold over the same stretch of river, and when her car came up the track and she got out, unhurried, no case in her hand this time, he understood before she said a single word that she'd already decided and had simply wanted to tell him somewhere that mattered rather than somewhere convenient. "I went back to Hartwell," she said without preamble. "I sat in the house I haven't properly lived in for 2 years, and I made myself ask the question honestly, instead of running the calculation the way I always do. Whether staying was a risk I could survive being wrong about. And I realized I've already survived the worst version of being wrong about someone. I buried him. I know exactly what the cost looks like when it's at its highest. I lived through it, and I'm still here." Her voice didn't waver, but something in her face had finally settled, the careful armor set down rather than simply cracked. "Which means the only thing I've actually been protecting myself from this whole time isn't loss. It's the ordinary, unremarkable risk of caring about someone who might, eventually, just be worth it. That's a considerably smaller thing to be afraid of than I'd built it up to be." "So you're staying?" "I'm staying." She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and then with the faintest, real smile. "Officially, for quarterly oversight of Mercer's administrative structure. Unofficially, because Tom apparently told Harry I'm the spreadsheet lady and he'd like me to stay. And I find I can't easily argue with that level of testimony." Leo laughed, properly, the sound surprising him with how easily it came, and crossed the last of the distance between them. They didn't say anything else for a while, because there wasn't, for once, anything that needed saying. Leo stood at his office window again that evening, the way he had so many evenings over the past 5 years, watching the operations room empty out below. Naomi was down there still. She was going over the southern reallocation one more time, unhurried now, home rather than passing through. Harry found him there, as he so often did. He didn't say anything for a while, just stood beside him looking down at the same scene. "You did it then," Harry said eventually. "She did most of it herself. Took the pair of you long enough." 5 years for me," Leo said, "give or take a week." Harry was quiet a moment, the particular quiet of a man who'd carried more weight for his friend than he'd ever admit to out loud. Then he said simply, "Lisa built you an empire you didn't know how to deserve. You've spent 5 years learning how. I'd say that's worth something." Leo thought of the boy downstairs, the alliance gathering. The woman who'd once been his wife, building a life entirely her own and entirely well-deserved. The woman now in the operations room, who'd watched him stand in the wreckage of his own mistakes, taken a week to decide whether the risk of him was worth taking, and chosen, finally and on her own terms, to stay. He hadn't rebuilt the life he'd thrown away. That life was gone, and rightly so, given to someone who'd earned it the first time round. But he'd built something else in its place, slower, harder won, and entirely his own. Standing at the window, watching the last of the evening light settle gold across the operations room, Leo Mercer understood, finally and completely, the lesson it had taken him. A broken marriage, 5 years, and the patient, unglamorous work of becoming a better man to learn. You couldn't rebuild what you'd lost, but if you were willing to learn from the losing of it, and willing to let the people around you choose you on their own terms rather than yours, you could build something new, and it could, against every reasonable expectation, be enough. Epilogue. 2 years later, the operations room had a cot in the corner of it, which Naomi insisted made no practical sense whatsoever, and had nonetheless allowed Leo to install without serious argument. "You said yourself this room runs better than the rest of the pack house," Leo pointed out, not for the first time. "I'm simply applying the same standard to childcare." "You're applying the same standard to keeping an eye on her while pretending you're reviewing quarterly reports." Naomi didn't look up from the file in front of her, though the corner of her mouth gave her away. "Your daughter has worked out that crying gets her picked up by the alpha within 4 seconds flat. She is, I'd remind you, already running this pack better than half the wolves on the payroll." Eleanor Mercer, 8 months old and entirely unbothered by the administrative chaos she'd been born into, chose that moment to fling a soft toy clear across the room with the focused, joyful violence of a child who'd not yet discovered consequences. Leo retrieved it without comment, the kind of unthinking, automatic motion that had become so thoroughly part of him over the past few weeks that he barely registered doing it anymore. Tom, 6 now, and recently appointed by himself to the unofficial role of Eleanor's chief protector, looked up from the corner where he'd been very seriously colouring outside every available line. "Is she going to be alpha when she's big?" he asked, with the same gravity he brought to most things. "That's rather a long way off," Leo said. "I'm telling everyone she will be." Tom returned to his colouring with the satisfaction of a matter settled. "Daddy says you have to be brave to be alpha. Naomi says you have to be honest. I think Eleanor's already both, because she screamed at Daddy yesterday and didn't even feel bad about it." "She has excellent instincts," Naomi agreed. Leo watched the pair of them, his daughter asleep again now in the crook of his arm, Tom's tongue poking out in concentration over a wax crayon, and Naomi across the table with her sleeves pushed up and a stack of files she was sorting through. It was nothing like the life he'd once thought he'd lost for good. It was something else entirely, built slower on steadier ground, and he found, watching the late afternoon light move across all of it, that he had absolutely no desire to be anywhere else. Harry found them there an hour later, the way he so often still did, and stood in the doorway, taking in the scene with his usual dry amusement. "You do know," Harry said, "that this used to be a working operations room." "It still is," Naomi said without looking up. "It's got a cot with a baby in it. Efficient use of space." She finally glanced up, the faintest smile crossing her face, the one she still didn't spend on just anyone. "Besides, she's quieter than most of the men you bring in here for boundary disputes." Harry laughed properly at that and came in to lift Tom up onto his shoulders despite the boy's loud and entirely insincere protest. The operations room, for a while longer that evening, was exactly as full, as loud, and as alive as Leo had once, in his very worst years, been certain he'd never get the chance to make it again. The end. And that's where we leave Leo Mercer. Not rescued, not let off the hook. 5 years of genuinely doing the work he needed to do, of listening when it was uncomfortable, of letting the people he'd hurt build their own happiness without him trying to insert himself back into it. That's what earned him the life he has now. Not the apology. The years after it, where he proved himself. I think that's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's true off the page as well as on it. We love a good redemption story, but real redemption is rarely the dramatic, tearful moment we imagine. It's quieter than that. It's showing up the same steady way, day after day, long after anyone's still watching to see if you mean it. It's choosing the harder, slower, right thing when the easier wrong thing would still get you most of what you want. Leo didn't get his second chance because he wanted one badly enough. He got it because he became someone worth giving one to. And that's a distinction worth remembering the next time you're tempted to mistake good intentions for actual change. If you enjoyed catching up with Leo, do let me know in the comments. I love hearing which characters you'd like to see again, and whether you'd have made Naomi forgive him quite so easily. Thank you, as ever, for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next story.